You're an expert in propaganda. So the first question I want to ask you is: I recently saw an event with Mark Curtis, the historian, in December at the Free the Truth event, and he said that the levels of propaganda are as high now as they've ever been since World War II. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think, yeah. Thanks for reminding me of the sad apologist smears. It's
Sorry
come
about
thick
that,
and
mate.
fast sometimes. Yeah, that's an interesting idea. This idea that we are now subjected to more intense propaganda than at any earlier point. And I haven't heard Mark Curtis's talk, but there are some reasons for thinking that that might well be the case. I think on the one hand, we've seen an unprecedented weakening of the mainstream media over the last 20 years. Job security, its ability to be independent, its ability to do investigative journalism, its confidence to hold power to account, I think has significantly diminished in certainly over the last 20 years. That's 30 years. And what that means is that, sort of, to the extent that mainstream media are at least notionally supposed to act as a resistance to or a challenge to power, because it's weakened, it means that propaganda activities carried out by powerful actors, whether big business or governments, has become that much more effective. So with a weakening media, you then got a sort of intensifying effectiveness, I think, of propaganda. So I think that that's an indication that things have got worse. I think on a more speculative basis, but I think sort of informed speculation, I think propaganda techniques have become more sophisticated and more developed over time. One of the problems that academics, politicians, even publics have in understanding democracies is the understanding that propaganda has actually been a central component to democracies throughout the 20th century. I
Hmm.
think people like Eddie Bernays, saw propaganda as a necessary part of managing democracy. And in some ways, the resources allocated to these activities, we used to call them propaganda, but we tend to call it public relations or strategic communication today. The resources devoted to these activities is really very, very extensive. Um, and I think one of the biggest industries, in fact, in throughout the West. And so we often sort of point to Russia or other countries around the world and sort of see them as, inherently propagandistic in terms of their media systems and government. But propaganda is a big industry in the West. And when you throw a lot of money and resources at these activities, they become very sophisticated. So I think, and there's been no indication of a decline in the resources allocated to propaganda, and probably over time a learning curve, so they become more sophisticated. So that's reasons for thinking that propaganda is more intensive than before. In some ways, however, my third point, the final thing I have to say on this is that the reality of the geopolitical context that the West has been in the last 20 years is critical in terms of starting to understand quite how much propaganda we might be being impacted by at this point in time.
Hmm.
The West, since 9/11, has been involved in multiple military operations, regime change wars in the international system. There is no dispute whatsoever that that is what has been going on in terms of attacking countries, fueling conflicts, invading countries, even as with the case with Iraq, with soldiers and tanks, etc.
Uh-huh.
And as we know, any historian of propaganda knows that wartime is a period when governments mobilize very significant resources to try and maintain public support for the wars that they're fighting. That's the reality of the last 20 years. Western belligerence and war fighting in the international system, starting with Afghanistan and possibly now leading ultimately to the end goal of a war with Iran, or some kind of conflict with Iran. And given that geopolitical reality, it's reasonable to assume that huge resources are being put into maintaining those wars, and that would, in addition to questions of change in the media, growing sophistication, I think provides a sort of a compelling prima facie case that yes, Mark was correct, that propaganda it's an acutely intensive is acutely intensive at this point in time in the West, and possibly at levels that we haven't seen since the Great War, World War One, or even the Second World War. It's a reasonable assessment, I think, from Mark.